Okay. Um, so I think we'll get started now. It's like a little after 8:30. It looks like some people are still coming on. But this is our webinar in travel medicine. So each of our speakers today are going to talk a little bit about kind of like how they got involved in sports med and then talk about their perspective and some advice that they have and recommendations for like med students and residents. And I'll be moderating. I'm Lauren Prisco. I'm an M3 at Cornell. Um, I'm right now the incoming president for the AMSSM MSIG. Um, and yeah, like I said, I'll be moderating. So if you guys have any like comments or questions throughout this, like you could put your, yeah. So if you go to more and then you go to the chat, you can put your questions and comments in the chat. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A and I'll just read them out. So now I'll introduce the speakers. So we have Dr. Tony Islas. He is, yep, there he is. He's a professor in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Nevada, Reno. He's dual boarded in family medicine and sports med, and he holds a certificate in travel health. He's currently the head team physician for the University of Nevada's athletics program and is the director of the sports med fellowship program there at UNR. And his career passion is wilderness medicine. So he was the medical director for the Guadalupe Mountains National Park, which he's probably going to talk about today. It sounds like he has some cool stories. And he's currently the medical director for the Great Basin National Park. And he's the current and founding director for the Wilderness Medicine Fellowship Program at the University of Nevada, Reno. And lastly, he's ex-president of the Wilderness Medical Society. And then we have Dr. Genevra Stone, and she spent 14 years, which is 4 Olympic cycles, balancing her love for medicine with her love for rowing. After failing to make the Beijing Olympic team, she started medical school at Tufts University School of Medicine. She took a leave during medical school to compete in the London Olympics, representing the US in the women's single. After graduating, she took another leave to race the single at the Rio Olympics, winning a silver medal. Then 1 year into the emergency medicine residency at Beth Israel Deaconess in Boston, she took a third leave to race the double at the Tokyo Olympics. And then eventually she graduated from residency, and now she's a sports med fellow at the University of Utah. And she hopes to return to Boston to practice emergency med and sports next year. Jevi's interests within sports med include high performance and women's health. And then lastly, but not least, we have Dr. Kyle Nagle, who earned his MD from the University of Wisconsin, Wisconsin-Madison Medical School, and his MPH from the University of Washington. He completed his pediatrics residency at Seattle Children's and the University of Washington, and then completed his primary care sports med fellowship at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Nagle is board certified in pediatrics and sports med and has been a team physician at the high school, collegiate, and elite levels, including the University of Wisconsin-Madison, University of Denver, Lincoln High School, and Seattle and Everett Community College. He is the head team physician for the US Paralympics Nordic ski team and has been a team physician for the US ski and snowboard and the US Nordic ski team. He's also been an international medical classifier for the International Paralympic Committee in Nordic skiing and biathlon. And his interests include athlete development, including resiliency, recovery, and continued lifelong athletic involvement for all ages and abilities, and particularly the overlap of these concepts within the realms of injury prevention, performance, and lifelong health. So first, I think we're going to start off with Dr. Tony Islas, if you're ready. Cool.
Well, thanks, Lauren. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk. I appreciate everybody at AMSSM, Joan Brown, and everyone for inviting me. AMSSM, I think for most of us that kind of have a little gray in the goatee is sort of that's our home base. It's kind of our home organization. So we're always really happy to be able to talk to anyone, especially the students when it comes to AMSSM, because it is something as a sports med doc, this is it. This is our home organization. This is sort of home base. This is where we feel most comfortable. I, however, am fortunate enough to have 2 organizations, really 3, that are home base for me as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But before that, a story. I was telling the other speakers earlier how did I get into wilderness medicine? What is wilderness medicine, and why is this important for me to know? Well, part of it is because I grew up in West Texas, and I grew up in El Paso. And if you're not familiar with El Paso, there's El Paso and not anything else. There's just not a whole lot of things around it. It's out in the middle of the Chihuahuan Desert. But one of the cool things about it is I'm only an hour or hour and a half away from all sorts of mountains. So what they called sky islands, right out in the southwest. Mountains come up, they elevate up maybe 8, 9,000 feet, and all of a sudden you get ponderosa pine forest. And I grew up in that sort of environment. I really enjoyed outdoors and outdoor sports, but never really enjoyed camping and hiking and bouldering and rock climbing at one point in my life. But I never really thought that I could parlay that into what I do for a living. Now, went off to college, and at some point, right before I went off to college, I was backpacking in Guadalupe Mountains National Park, and me and my partner at the time, partner as in friend, backpacking partner, not partner romantically, we're coming down the mountain, basically, or coming off of our backpack to the parking lot, and we ran into a rescue being in action. A young man had fallen and has a tib fracture. They had splinted him and put him in a carrier, and were rushing him down the mountain as fast as they could. And it was not, you couldn't miss it. It was 10 people rushing this guy down the hill. And they came upon us and they asked, "Hey, do you want to help?" And we said, "Well, yeah, of course. How cool is this?" So we're helping a bunch of rangers push this guy down the mountain. We thought that was really cool. Got down the parking lot, and from the parking lot, they loaded him into the back of the pickup truck. I happened to be one of the guys holding on to the basket at the time, as was my partner on the other side. And so we just kind of jumped in the back of the pickup truck and drove off for about maybe 2 or 3 blocks to the highway, and stopped, and literally as if on cue, a very large helicopter appeared just over the highway horizon, on the other side, came across, landed in the middle of the highway. Guy popped out, signaled us to come. The rangers yelled out, "Let's go!" So I grabbed hold of it, ran over, shoved him in the helicopter, ran back to the truck. We got in. I got in the truck, looked back. The helicopter guy gave us the thumbs up, and then it just kind of took off, turned around, and then disappeared under the horizon, and then eventually out into the desert. And at that point, I was hooked. I knew that at some way, somehow, I'm going to make this part of what I do. It was just a kind of one of those moments where you're like, "Oh man, this is so good." So fast forward a number of years, I'm in residency, and I start seeing this kind of flyer go around about these wilderness medicine meetings, these conferences that are happening. I've continued to do a lot of outdoor stuff. I still go a lot of backpacking, and I figured, you know what, maybe this is a way. I went to a couple of these conferences and I was hooked because it was combining all the medicine I had learned in medical school and using it to actually be someone that can be either there to help you get on the helicopter or to be used to prevent you from having to use the helicopter. And I really enjoyed it. I actually found out that the first couple of years I was doing this, I was actually going to another conference. I wasn't going to the Wilderness Medical Society. I was going to a private conference. There are a lot of conferences out there, and I will tell you, there's 3 main vendors in the United States that do these kind of conferences, and all of them are really great. But the Wilderness Medical Society is the medical society, and that actually became one of my homes. Like AMSSM, WMS is actually a huge home for me. And it was through the WMS that I really got active in wilderness medicine on the national scale, working on projects like wilderness first aid curriculum, not only for the Boy Scouts, but for the American Red Cross, and putting together curriculum for all sorts of different things, but also meeting like-minded people and having doors open for me that allowed me to actually start practicing all the stuff I was learning, whether it was through junkets, working for different private companies, well-known companies with little square symbols, or working for WMS all the way up to Everest, and being able to go and be an Everest Base Camp attendee for a number of years with a group of other physicians. Phenomenal opportunities for me personally, and things that completely changed my life. I know that I was hooked, and hooked bad. But I started to try to think, well, how do I make this something that I do every day? Uh, and am I done? Is it wilderness medicine and sports medicine? I realized that these guys, that everyone I'm taking care of are athletes, and that if I learn to be a good physician, I should be a good physician for both these individuals in their environment using the wilderness medicine knowledge base, and then also to consider them athletes using the sports medicine knowledge base, and that would give me a leg up. And so I really worked hard at trying to make that sort of my life's mission, my life's career, and was able to do so. I found it easier to do that in academia. I personally like teaching, and that's kind of my story. But through academia, it's hard to get paid to be a wilderness medicine physician. Really, to bring home the bacon, I still have to do the sports med stuff, and I still love doing sports for the University of Nevada. I love. We just got a brand new football coach today. Football is fantastic. Basketball is awesome. I love all of our sports, our runners, or soccer players. But I will tell you, for me personally, my favorite things have always been I'm dressed up in a really cold environment and have an icicle hanging off of one of my goatees, and I'm taking care of a Sherpa or somebody that's trying to climb a mountain. And those have been phenomenal experiences. I thought I was done. However, I had an epiphany not too long ago, actually, in that, one of the things that I do and have done for a lot of years is take care of athletes in austere places, not just in the United States, but also internationally. And I found that I was having a lot of problems with a lot of climbers going international and not being prepared, whether it's not necessarily prepared physically, but prepared medically. And I find that really and truly it's been an issue. I have some guys that will show up to places that, maybe they show into India, and we're going to go to northern India, into the Indian Alps area or Indian Himalaya area. But they'll land somewhere and try to do this tour of India and not have any malaria prophylaxis, or not have typhoid vaccine. Guys going to Africa to climb Kilimanjaro, which is fantastic and wonderful. But oh yeah, we're going to do Kilimanjaro, which is in Tanzania. However, we're going to go see the elephant orphanage in Kenya, not realizing that, oh, that's a yellow fever area, and you really want to get your yellow fever vaccine, because Tanzania won't let you back in the country if you decide to go there to look at the elephant orphanage. So those kinds of things are things that I found a lot of my climbers, my athletes, were not really prepared for. And when my teams from UNR go internationally, I'm always asking questions like, so does anybody have problems with altitude? Does anybody have problems? Does someone get altitude sickness, or does someone get traveler's diarrhea all the time when you travel into foreign countries? And are you prepared for that? What should you take for that? And so I found another love and another home, and that home was the International Society of Travel Medicine. And so I became a certificate holder, took the tests, studied, became a member, studied, took the test. One of my mentors in wilderness medicine was also a large name, a mentor in travel medicine, and I was able to follow in his footsteps. So for my career, I've really been able to kind of do this crazy thing where I've actually gone through sports medicine, wilderness medicine, and travel medicine to sort of create a niche for myself. And it's been really good. I've really enjoyed it. It's been a lot of fun for me. And if these are the kind of things that you're interested in, then maybe this is something for you to do. There is a path. Getting involved in both AMSSM and WMS is probably a start. Starting to think about joining maybe the International Society of Travel Medicine is a start. And I would encourage you, if these things maybe are things that sort of, stoke your fire and are a passion of yours, to come and join us, because we need more physicians that are trained in this way. I know that I only had 15 minutes, and I know that there might be questions about, what was it, about doing things that I've done, about what is it like to actually work with climbers. It's a lot like working with ultra endurance athletes, very motivated, willing to sacrifice a finger. I've had all sorts of crazy things. I had a guy one time that got pinned through his index finger and his long finger because of a rock slide accident in Kathmandu. And we were at Goreshep, which is actually famous because that's where in Batman Begins, that's where Batman goes to like become a member of the League of Shadows. It's up in the Himalayas. It's not there. The League of Shadows don't live there. There's nothing there. It's the last bit of it's the last sort of area before you make it to base camp. And he's sitting there and asking me to pull the pins out of his fingers because he can't clamp on the Jumar, which is a climbing apparatus that you need to arrest your backward motion on a rope. And of course, I'm looking at him saying, no, I'm not doing this in the middle of a yak yard. I'm not pulling the pins out of your bones and leaving an open area. And plus, it was way too early. It was at 4 weeks, and you probably need to go a little longer. But those are the kind of things that you'll run into, all sorts of craziness. So if this interests you and you're excited about doing some of this stuff, look for wilderness medicine opportunities, whether it's through AMSSM, through WMS, or through ISTM. I appreciate the time to sit and talk to you all, and I'll turn it back over to Lauren.
Thanks so much, Dr. Islas. That sounds very exciting, and I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions for you at the end. So I guess we'll move on to Dr. Stone, who's going to talk a little bit about her perspective as an Olympic athlete and kind of like the considerations that we should take as providers for athletes.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My stories are not quite as exciting, I would say. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully this works. Oh, got to go back to the beginning. Right. People can see it, hopefully.
Yeah.
So when Jonah emailed me, she mentioned my view as an athlete, and she mentioned changing time zones. And this is not a comprehensive picture at all in terms of everything you need to think about as a doctor taking care of athletes who are traveling for either competition or training. But it is many of the things that I came up with a little bit of help from my dad, who was my coach when I raced internationally, of many of the things that a provider should be aware of in terms of what the athletes are thinking about when we are traveling. So even before you get to time zone changes and dealing with where you are, travel in and of itself is a serious process for athletes. Amazingly or shockingly, I couldn't find any pictures of rowers sleeping in airport terminals, even though I know there are many of them on my phone because it happened many times. But this is a photo of the ceiling of the Madrid airport, which at the time I thought was very cool. The point of this is that many of the competitions for international athletes do involve red eyes, especially as much of the competition is in Europe and many of us are based in the US. Sometimes we're traveling less than a week before international competition. So sleep on the plane and during travel can be critical. I'm lucky to be a very good sleeper and I'm able to sleep on the plane. Not every athlete is that fortunate. It is important to kind of optimize that situation so you can fall asleep before the plane takes off. So having earplugs, face masks, travel pillows, some people take melatonin, NyQuil, Tylenol PM, that type of thing. Make sure you check it on Global DRO to make sure it's legal before you do it. Wearing comfortable clothes and just getting as much sleep as possible to maintain consistency. Thinking about your flight plans too. Once I flew through Dublin, and that was a mistake I will never make again because it chops the flight to Europe into two very small bits, really disrupting the sleep. Also, in terms of staying comfortable in travel supplies, my apologies to Dr. Provencher, who's an orthopedic surgeon in sports, who's in this picture, but I ran into him in the Logan Airport on the way to Tokyo. And this was the only picture I could find at the time of my wearing compression socks and a mask. We are still, even in the post-COVID era age, I know the team still travels in masks. They're very aware of limiting the exposure to any viral pathogens that might be in the air. Compression socks reduce swelling in flight and when you land, which makes you feel better. There also is a theoretical risk because athletes have a lower basal heart rate and lower blood pressures of increased DVTs and other clotting issues. I know at least 2 female rowers that have gotten upper extremity venous clots in Europe. So I believe that travel probably played a role. In terms of traveling, so you might not get where you want as quickly as you want. This is a picture of a church in Munich when we were stuck on an 8-hour layover traveling back from a World Cup. When athletes are traveling, it's usually in the middle of a racing season. That's usually why we travel, because training we can do at home. So it's important to stay as active as you can, just to flush. This was after a day of racing, so you want to kind of stay mobile and to lose as little fitness as possible. So my dad, who was our coach at the time, did a little bit of research and found this church that was not far outside the airport. So we left, put our stuff in storage at the airport, went to this church, ran up and down the stairs a few times in order to stay active in the midst of a layover. Sometimes it's harder to plan because you get stuck in a delay. I know the US team was stuck in Milan for almost 12 hours on the way to the World Championships there, and kind of optimizing it as much as you can, whether that's with airport yoga or walking up and down the terminal as many times as you can. It doesn't matter what kind of looks you get from the passengers, other passengers in the airport. Other travel things that we're aware of is staying fueled. Airport food is really not the healthiest, although the sodium does encourage water drinking. But staying fueled with our supplies, this was kind of one of the more gourmet plain meals I've had. This is courtesy of the US rowing dietitian between Hawaii and Tokyo. But we always travel with Cliff Bars, trail mix, whatever we think we might need on the flight to stay appropriately fueled between sessions. When we arrive at our destination, you're not usually there. This is a bunch of male rowers in London being bad examples of sleeping as soon as we landed, which was probably late morning in London, which is going to make it harder to fall asleep once you get to London. So sleeping on the plane as much as you can. And also I would try to switch time zones prior to flying. So I would try to get at least 2 hours closer to my destination time zone. It means going to bed stupidly early on the East Coast, but it's worth it to make the transition easier on the other side. We are lucky as rowers to have daylight competition. I know that swimmers in Rio, in addition to having, it actually wasn't that much time zone change for Rio, it was only 1 hour, but they were racing at prime time for US television, which meant midnight local time. And in their training camps, they were having to do practices in the darkness and basically the middle of the night in order to optimize their body and make sure they were awake during that time. Sleep is not always easy when you get to your destination. The cardboard beds in Tokyo were actually surprisingly comfortable. I like a firm mattress, and our team manager got mattress pads for those that didn't think it was comfortable. But you are dealing with some pretty cheap sheets and pillows, which I was almost more sensitive to. You're also in close quarters with a roommate at an age when most of us are beyond our roommate experiences. And the walls are really thin because the apartments are built temporarily as a dorm room. So it's 3 bedrooms and a common room. Eventually they'll get converted to a kitchen and a dining room and a bedroom or whatever else the design is. But in order to do that, they put in temporary walls. So sound carries really easily. As courteous as athletes are, you can really hear everything. That's the Olympic Village as an example, but sometimes when you're traveling, you just don't anticipate what might be around. We were at an Airbnb training for 3 months in Austin, Texas. It seemed perfect. It was like a mile from the course, really close to the grocery store. What we didn't realize is there was a church across the street that rang bells super loudly every half hour between 8 a.m. and 10 p.m. 10 p.m. was about 90 minutes past our bedtime, and it was really hard to optimize sleep even with earplugs. Okay, so we've done through travel to the competition. Travel at competition is also an issue. This is a photo from the Olympics, obviously. In London, we were at a remote satellite village. We had about half an hour to the course in each direction, which was similar in Tokyo. But in Rio, we had 2-hour drives with traffic in each direction. And all that time on buses can lead obviously to stiffness, which was something you would think about. And it's kind of easy to think about standing up as often as you can, moving things around. But something to be aware of is just that also you can perseverate mentally on the races. So making sure rowers are kind of distracted and mentally optimized and prepared for these bus rides, whether it's with podcasts, audiobooks, or music, and awkward moments with competition. I've had some very funny conversations with my competition on buses to the course. Car sickness is another thing to be aware of, really bad in Rio. So planning ahead first with some Zofran for athletes that are susceptible. Speaking of upset stomachs, the food. This is the Olympic Village cafeteria in London. which was very well prepared for every type of cuisine, but very overwhelming. As you can see, it is a giant. It's the size of about 4 football fields. And athletes of every nation are cramming about. And sometimes it's intimidating because you see someone very famous. And sometimes it's intimidating because there's so many options. At the World Cup or World Championships, there are not as many options. You're traveling with the team, staying at a hotel, dealing with hotel food. And that can range from great, kind of what you would eat in the US for breakfast, to dinners that are undercooked chicken that probably are salmonella feeding grounds, and 2 types of fried potatoes with iceberg lettuce as the vegetable. Fortunately, on those trips, you have a little bit more access to the outside world, so you can go to the grocery store to supplement. I would always do that, as I like eating oatmeal, even if I raced in the afternoon. And one of the hotels in Switzerland knew me as Oatmeal Girl because I would come to lunch with my like pre-packaged oatmeal from the grocery store. Which brings me to packing ahead of time for the food supplies you're going to need. This is, unfortunately, I couldn't find a picture of all the food supplies I would bring, but this is a noon shipment to me. But I would pack noon, I would pack Cliff Bards, I would pack trail mix, I would pack goo, whatever I needed to be appropriately fueled, because you can't always find what you want in other countries, or at the Olympics, you really don't have access to grocery stores or leaving the village to buy those things. So making sure you pack those ahead of time. Food in some places is delicious. This is France. Food in other places, this is the Rio dining hall, an example of my being unable to find anything that I thought was edible except for a ice cream bar. I ate a lot of rice and beans, and the Irish rower I'm friends with was shocked. She thought the beans had gone bad because they were black. She'd never seen black beans before. She'd only seen red and white beans. But the Rio dining hall was really a problem. There was kind of cardboard frozen pizza that was barely reheated, and Panda Express like Chinese food that was super saturated with salt. And so making do with what you can. It's obviously not optimal in your performance environment like the Olympics, and trying to figure it out, working with your team, dietitians and managers to figure out how to get fueled as properly as you can. Which brings me to this, all the things you have to pack, just planning with your team if you're covering to make sure they have all the things they need to bring, maybe bringing some extras yourself. Athletes may forget to bring sunscreen, that's in the bottom left corner. All the massage tools you use at home, whether it's a foam roller, a Theracane, a marshmallow stick, supplements that you use at home. Never mind the sports specific equipment. Another thing to consider at international venues, especially Olympics, is walking. The dining hall from our hotel, or dorm room rather, in Tokyo was about a 10-minute walk, a little over half a mile probably, to the dining hall. So planning ahead, making sure athletes are prepared to spend that time on their feet. The last thing you want is to get to a competition and be expecting to taper and then not be prepared for all this extra walking. So knowing ahead of time how to accommodate that, and making sure that in the months leading up to it, you just spend some time on your feet walking. Equipment, travel means new or borrowed equipment. This is a bunch of coaches and boat makers trying to rig the Puerto Rican singles boat in Rio. Sometimes equipment doesn't fit the same way as it does at home, or it's new and it's rigged improperly, which has happened to me as well. So being aware that injuries may happen due to equipment that isn't what athletes are used to, or training environments that aren't what the athletes expect to do. The course happened to be closed at the World Championships in France one year, and getting on the rowing machine, making sure athletes are only doing activities which their body is used to, because the last thing you want is new muscle soreness a few days before competition. Climate, another big thing to think about in travel. This is from Tokyo. Tennis was canceled at least once. Rowing was almost canceled on the day that tennis was canceled, but was just really hot instead. But thinking ahead of time, making sure athletes plan. If it's a cold environment, making sure they have the layers that they need and that will be appropriate for competition. If it's a hot environment, one of the things we did for Tokyo was spend time in saunas ahead of time. So we were in the sauna about every other day in the 2 months leading up to Tokyo to try to heat acclimatize as much as possible. I know I'm running out of time. Rushing through this, one of the last topics I wanted to talk about was mental preparedness. And this is something that as an EM provider, we don't really discuss much, but the psych side of things is a critical part in terms of sports performance. This is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. It's a little town in Austria, but it's also one of the loneliest places I've ever been. I was training with the Austrian single in her hometown. Most people didn't speak English. I was living in a neighbor's room. So she included me in everything she could. I had all the meals with her family, but her dad also didn't speak English. There was a lot of German being spoken. And I was 6 hours away by time zone from my friends and family via the phone, internet, Wi-Fi, etc. It was a lot of time just being by myself and during a hard training segment. So just be helping athletes be as prepared as possible for those mental challenges, figuring out their strategies to how to deal with this and how it might impact performance. One of the things that worked with me was anti-stress, like these little coloring books. Reading was also very helpful. But I think anything like this, it's helpful to be aware ahead of time and to just check in with athletes. In other environments, it's exactly the opposite. This is from the Rio Olympics. Because we were so far away as a venue, as a 2-hour drive, USOPC hired out a sports club for us to hang out in. We were there with badminton, gymnastics, and basketball. And it was this half a gym for all of us to hang out for multiple hours a day. And so it's a lot of people with no space to get away from it. So it's kind of the flip side of being lonely. If you don't get along with your teammates, if team dynamics aren't perfect, if you need that space, there can be tensions, and being aware of the potential impact of that on athletes and their performance. Lastly, pandemics, you never know when they're going to happen, but just being ready to adapt on your feet. Our team doc in Tokyo did a lot of stuff that team docs really haven't done before, including COVID samples all the time, every day for every athlete, and managing that logistics. So I think being flexible as a team doctor and kind of reacting on your feet to whatever might crop up in different places of the world, whether it's food poisoning or a global pandemic, just being aware that you're probably not going to be entirely prepared, but you will be able to adapt. And that is the last slide I had. Hopefully I didn't go too far over.
Yeah, that was really interesting. The pictures were also cool to see, like the behind the scenes of the Olympics.
The random shots from my phone at random points.
Yeah, thank you. And then, yeah, so our last speaker is Dr. Kyle Nagle, and he's going to just talk about his experience as team physician at international venues. So whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Lauren. And I think I have to it's awesome going after you guys because Tony and Jevi, you guys have brought up a lot of really good points. And so I think it's interesting to think about that and think about the entire team that goes into taking care, especially at the Olympics or Paralympic Games, and how much, that nutritionist and that the team kitchen, team nutrition room, saved us when we were in Beijing for the Winter Games. It was unbelievable how much support you can sometimes get. But I did prepare some slides. I got into medicine from wilderness medicine, actually. So Tony and I kind of got into this from the same way. And then I was leading wilderness trips and stuff like that. And so sports medicine for me was a way to be part of the team building side, group dynamic side of stuff was something that I really enjoyed and valued. And so when I started thinking about me traveling with sports teams, I started thinking about, and I kind of wanted to give you a sense really of kind of what I'm thinking about as I'm preparing to travel with teams, particularly to international venues. And so that's kind of like the perspective that I was going to share with you guys today. A little more nuts and boltsy, but hopefully it'll have some good information in here. I'm going to just share this here as well. So nothing to disclose, whatever. So I think the things that I start really thinking about when someone says, "Hey, we're going with a team on a trip somewhere for a competition or whatever," these are kind of like when I started just brainstorming recently of what do I really think about. Some of it is I've been doing this for I've been to 3 cycles now of Paralympic Games in various different roles, but the past 2 I was as team doc. And these are the kind of things I start thinking about, or if I go to a World Cup, is the length of the trip that I'm going on, or the team, if I'm not actually going on with the team, but I'm thinking about the team going on a trip. the length of the trip. And sometimes these are multiple events in one quote unquote trip, because they might go to various different competitions within one before they come back to the States, before they come back home. I started thinking about the accessibility to safe, high quality care, safe being if there's issues with infectious disease or things like that. I also started thinking about ease of travel, whether it's ease of travel to get back from wherever they're at. So are they going to Canada, or are they, staying in North America, or are they going somewhere where it's going to be a 12-hour flight at best to get back? And frequency, meaning how often are there flights, or how often are there things to get back from these things. Global local conditions, COVID, obviously in the more recent games, that was a huge issue. Zika was an issue for the athletes going to Rio. So I think that there's certain things that come up that you have to start thinking about. And then team medical conditions, these would be things that it would be common things that you think about, both from an individual, but also kind of a more public healthy hat that I put on. In my background, I have an MPH as well. So kind of like start thinking about this as the population, as the group that I'm taking care of. And then also understanding like the illness and injury epidemiology of whatever event you're going into. And if you know that, it's better. So this is kind of what I started thinking about too, preparing to travel with the team, like current health, making sure that you touch base with all the athletes, past medical history, understanding like what their history is. If someone has a history of, car sickness, like actually that's really helpful to know before you go. Allergies for Paralympic. I'm one of the Paralympic docs, and that can be really helpful because some people are allergic to latex because of frequent exposure to catheterizations, or have they been exposed or have colonization with bacteria resistant bugs? Because suddenly you're like, oh, I know this person gets UTIs really frequently. I better make sure that we have XYZ antibiotic instead of the usuals. Immunizations, this goes into what Tony was talking with travel medicine. I think it's super important, particularly where you go, to make sure that people are up to date with their immunizations in general. I often go to the CDC and find out. I'm kind of lucky. Almost all the teams, Olympic and Paralympic sports that I've covered are winter sports, which seasonally ends up limiting some of your insect-borne diseases, which is great. But at the same time, foodborne illness is a big issue. So we want to make sure that we have that. And then supplying and making sure you have an adequate med kit. As previously mentioned, you're trying to prevent things and be able to respond to things that you can predict, but also being aware that there's always going to be curveballs, and so having some of that, trying to cover your bases, but sometimes everybody can't take along an x-ray machine or an ultrasound machine. So you have to, be somewhat flexible along those lines. And with that is understanding, if you have a place where you're going, trying to figure out, if you can, or get in touch with other teams that may have been in that same place, an emergency action plan to understand, hey, where are the local resources, who's going to be on site, what kind of first aid do you have at the venue, what's the local doctor's office to get an x-ray if you need one, or tertiary care center if there's something more in depth, or repatriation things if you do need to actually get out of that country to someplace else. So these are things to start thinking about, or at least that I start thinking about when I'm coming into this. Pre-participation exams, this is just a chance to touch base with everybody. It gives a sense of where you're at, where people are at, and any current ongoing health stuff. I think it's important to consider this, and if you can, getting ahead of the game with as much as possible. So if you can be involved with that aspect of athlete care, that's super helpful, just so you know where things are at and have time for follow-up workup and stuff like that, as opposed to something be like, oh man, you've been dealing with kidney stones for the past 3 months. Geez, I wish I had known about that, because we could have actually dealt with that before having to manage at the time. And so thinking about specifics of the medical kit, these are kind of, when I think about medications, I kind of group things into different things. When I used to be in wilderness medicine, I was like, you can improvise a lot of things, but the couple things that you really can't improvise, pain control, and there's limitations as far as traveling with pain meds, and antibiotics are like really common things that are really hard to improvise. Epinephrine would be another one if you have allergies and things. So those are things that I start thinking about, hey, what can we kind of get by? What do we really need versus not? And then fluids. Oftentimes, and where I'm traveling, we have rules as far as World Cup, as far as no IVs or where do you go. And so you're trying to think, and this goes into that multidisciplinary approach where suddenly you're working with your nutritionist, if you have one, to say, hey, what kind of rehydration solutions are already going to be at the venue or with the team And again, that nutrition component, Jerry, I can't emphasize enough how key that is for everybody. Like that can be illness, but it can also be mental health, like that nutrition room became like the coffee shop of our team. Like it was the place where everybody hung out because it was really the safe spot to be. And food brings everybody together in the best possible way. So here's some pictures. I actually don't often take these, and this was from a colleague of mine who is one of the team docs, and this is what he carries. I often don't bring as much of the kind of symptomatic stuff, whether it's cough drops or decongestants. This may be personal bias, but I think having some general stuff along these lines is a good idea. Some teams will like it, some athletes will like it. I think it's also something that you can often say, hey, if you're a person who really likes cough drops, try to pack some in your own kit as opposed to packing it as a whole team. Same thing, like, hey, if you know that you have seasonal allergies or environmental allergies and often take loratadine, great. Make sure you bring a little supply of that. It helps as far as making sure every person is prepared, as well as not necessarily using as many of the medications from the med kit if they don't need to. If it's something that can be anticipated, can be helpful. These are the 3 lists that I kind of work with when I start thinking about our team, our specific team, as far as meds. Going, like I said, like I went back in a couple of slides ago, I tend to group them into like GI things, pain meds, allergy medications and stuff like that. But I have the big kit if we're going someplace that's more remote, not necessarily as remote as the Himalaya, which you might add a number of other things in there as well. But this would be something like when we travel to Beijing or something for us, when not in Beijing itself, but we were way up in the border of China. And that was a little bit different situation because of the USOPC had some stuff too. But if we went there for like a travel or a test event, that would be something, or if they're going for a longer time to a place that doesn't have as good service, that's what I would do. The middle one is kind of what we call our small kit. Is what I recommend. Like if we're going to, say, a place in Europe where there's generally good medical care, say, I don't know, I'm just going to pick one, Sweden, or something like that, where there's generally good medical care, but maybe you want something where that could tide the athletes over until they get back. As you can see on here, there's a bunch of things, some general antihistamines, some general pain medicines, some stuff for reflux or traveler's diarrhea, and then some of your basic antibiotics. For me, with a Paralympic team, I tend to have a little bit broader mix of antibiotics, again, because we're dealing with issues where some of the athletes, it's not uncommon to have more frequent UTIs or various or resistant bugs that are in there. So kind of trying to cover up a couple things. And then the last column there is just kind of like personal meds. This is what I kind of would say, hey, these are common ones that some people might have, think about it again. If you use these on a regular basis, bring your own supply of these also. So that's kind of what I'm thinking along that line. This is a way I tend to organize it. Again, it's kind of grouped for me. It just works as far as grouped by a little bit more, physiologic system, if you will. And wound care is in there too. And then I also made this list here of other supplies that I would bring along. Wound care is one of the big ones, just bleeding supplies. Again, if you're in an austere environment, you can improvise a lot of these things. So do you need to bring everything? No, but sometimes it's really nice if someone has a little cut on their thumb to be able to put something on there just to cover it up. But then a thermometer, stethoscope, trauma shears, otophthalmoscope. You'd be shocked. Actually, when I travel with the ski teams, the otoscope is actually something that I have used not infrequently because people have earwax impaction. And so maybe this is my pediatric training or something, but man, I can't tell you how many times people have come to me being like, geez, Doc, can you get some of the wax out? I'm like, sure, no problem. So it's kind of funny that ends up being something that I often need, but that's something that, again, that's hard to improvise. Blood pressure, cough, tongue depressors, cotton swabs, fluorescein. If anybody has a corneal abrasion, can be really helpful to have. And then again, in current times, having some viral test kits if you're traveling in a place that needs that. Things are changing all the time, so keeping up on that is helpful. Emergency action plans. This is kind of like it's a formal way of saying like going through the what if scenarios in your head of like, hey, what if XYZ happens? What am I going to do? And then getting a sense of what these are. And so this can be, hey, at the venue and having a map, whether it's of the local venue or even the local city, of where things are and a plan to go where to go for what and when to go where. So depending on the level of severity of the illness or injury, where you're going to. And so oftentimes I'll identify things like, hey, where's the first aid people at the site, at the venue? Are they at the finish line? Are they here? Are they dressed? Are they wearing orange vests or yellow vests, or some way of identifying them if you have something urgent that goes on right there in competition? And then identifying like local urgent care options for, again, the non-urgent, not emergent x-rays or things like that, but also local hospitals. Pharmacy is sometimes really helpful thing to understand where that is. And then understanding transport options. How are you going to get people there, whether it's going to be by helicopter or ground transportation, repatriation options. That's what, like, again, if you need someone to actually get removed, evacuated from a foreign country, having that in place before you go can be really helpful. And a lot of times the teams will help you with this, but something just to keep in mind, like how am I going to do this? Global Rescue is, I'm just going to say, it's a brand name. It's a company that I've used, or I've not used per se, but I've been signed up with through the teams as much. There are a number of other options out there. And then also the final thing is just communication plans and having that in place and thinking about that, particularly if you have things where you're suddenly traveling away from the venue, away from the team because of medical things. How are you going to get in touch with people, whether that's cell phone? Is it going to be sat phone? Is it going to be cell phone using Wi-Fi and WhatsApp, which is typically a really common way that I've used in country, but like going to China was totally different because suddenly you can't use your own phones and things like that. So it becomes much more challenging depending on where you're going. So having that in place. Here's just an example of one of the EAPs that we used in the past, and understanding like, hey, here's a picture of the medical center. Here's where the hospital is. It's not in the same town, but it's a little bit outside. Here's the pharmacy in town, just down the street. When is it open? And then there's the event medical supervisor and where it's going to be. They're going to be wearing this yellow paramedic outfit. So that's what you look at. And this is something that you could even use yourself to kind of help prepare as far as understanding where it is and where you're going to go and what's kind of feeling like you have things in place before you go. And again, if you can, I mean, a lot of it is trying to prepare for what you can anticipate and trying to reduce the risk of that and preparing ahead of time as much as you can to reduce risk, having an idea of where you're going to go for if things do happen. And then like what both, Jevi and Tony mentioned before, there is a lot, which is just winging it, having that ability to just wing stuff as much as you can on the fly, and the flexibility of, oh man, okay, well, we're going to have to be here for 3 more hours than we needed to. How can we make that work? So there's a lot of needing to be flexible that goes into international travel, and just being a good teammate, if you will, not being one who's demanding things right on time, but pitching in to help moving gear if you need to, or, going to fetch or find a, potable water source for athletes if there's something you find yourself in one of these situations where they we're going to have a longer layover or somewhere and things like that. So it's just kind of helping out and having that good attitude and being flexible as much as possible. So, here's just a picture of the communication tree. License and liability, I thought I'd throw this in there. It's something that a lot of people don't think about, I think, when they start thinking about going places, not to be the downer on it, but there's a lot of different institutions that have different rules regarding this, and a lot of different countries have different rules regarding this. So it's just something to think about, as far as if you are going to go with teams or in these settings, if you're covering an expedition or things like that, just thinking about how you're going to do this, how you're going to get your liability covered and stuff like that. And it can take time to figure that out. So allowing that time and planning ahead is definitely something to think about that way too. So anyway, without belaboring stuff longer, I think I took plenty of time, and we should still have some time for questions. I will just cut it short there and turn things over to everybody else.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. Let's see in the chat. Okay. Well, if anyone has questions now for Dr. Islas, Dr. Stone, or Dr. Nagle, you can like unmute or put it in the chat. Oh, looks like we have, oh, maybe not. Well, I had a question actually, for Dr. Islas. I was wondering, and Dr. Nagle as well, kind of how both of your residency positions, in like family medicine and pediatrics, prepared you for wilderness medicine and these situations, and I guess also like the pathway that you took to choosing those residency programs.
It's a good question. I guess I saw Kyle give me he gave me the finger. I saw it. I had one of my mentors and one of the best wilderness medicine physicians of our time, Brownie Shoney, who did a lot of the original work at altitude. He once told me, if you want to be a good wilderness medicine physician, learn to be a good physician first. And so the idea that everything that you do, whether as a sports medicine, wilderness medicine, that combination out there, whatever you decide to do in regards to this, learn the medicine first. Be a good physician first. So get the most out of your residency program, right? And think about, in your residency program, when you're learning to do procedures or staying up late one night taking care of a patient on the floor, whether you're a night float or on call, and it seems like it's kind of drudgery and you're having to fill out paperwork and you're up until whatever. Those are learning experiences, and oftentimes when we're in the midst of it, it gets difficult to appreciate. But I will tell you, I've spent a lot of sleepless nights awake on mountaintops, waiting for things to happen, for the sun to come up, for the wind to stop blowing, and those times I'm filling out forms, I'm talking to people, trying to arrange helicopter rescue. And that's the training you receive in residency is directly related. Plus, it's like skill sets, right? You're learning skill sets as you go along. And so the residency program, and whether it's EM or family medicine, that is a skill set. But then you extrapolate that and learn to take that skill set and grow it by adding wilderness medicine training, sports medicine training, international travel medicine training. All those things are skill sets. So your residency program is the meat and potatoes of everything that you build on top of that. And so that's important. And so how you choose residencies, oftentimes in wilderness medicine, we think about EM as being the residency, but you can do wilderness medicine as, like Kyle, he's a pediatrician. He's a great wilderness medicine doctor, probably has phenomenal experiences. I'm a family medicine doctor. Yes, there are a lot of EM doctors out there, but the guy who wrote the original wilderness medicine book, Medicine for Mountaineers, is a pathologist. So you don't think about it in those terms, right? But yes, it is a separate skill set. And so that separate skill set is actually something that you need, that base medical residency level of training to build upon. And I'll be quiet there and let Kyle take over.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Tony. And I think there's also things where it's really tempting, I think, for us in general, to think about wanting that balance right now. And I think it's okay to say, hey, I'm not necessarily like, I'm doing this with a plan to get somewhere down the road. So even if I did pediatric residency, I might not have done a ton of sports medicine in pediatric residency, but knowing that that was the direction that I was going during that time, it helps to be like, hey, this is going in that direction. I think in addition, I agree with Tony completely as far as learning the skills of just being a good physician, right? That's part of it. I think also in there is also being a good teammate. And a lot of times you can be a good technical physician all you want, but if you don't have that team approach, you're going to be missing something. And it's about that bedside manner. It's about understanding how to communicate. It's about learning how to work with multidisciplinary, other providers, whether it's nutritionists, whether it's psych, learning how to work with athletes, just helping out where you can without being like over the top and following someone into the bathroom, unless they need you to. But I mean, it's something where, just being, when you're with the team, being present, and helping out. And, if you have those times where you're sitting there, whether it's on the mountain or not, being someone who's people enjoy being around, and that personality side it's not, I mean, I'm pretty introverted actually, but I still really enjoy interacting with people, and interacting with the team. And I hope that, I think based on my history, it's, teams have gotten along well with me. But I think that's something that you can learn how to do as well, but it's something to really keep in mind is being a team player. Like it is, even an individual sport is not, an individual sport, really. There's a whole team behind it, and being able to play that role as much as you're spending time on, learning this medication or this procedure, like also be thinking about being a good person and a good teammate at the same time. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Especially because it seems like these, like what Dr. Stone was talking about, kind of like the psychological impact of going, traveling for these sports. Like you want a doctor that you can go to talk about these things. So it makes sense.
And travel is just stressful for everybody. And there's certain things, like when I went to China for the Paralympic Games recently, that was the most stressful experience I've, bar none, than other times. But it's stressful for everybody, and if you can relieve some of that stress, whether it's through appropriate humor or just to bring a coffee to someone who seems like they're more tired, like sometimes that helps a ton. So I mean, like, yeah, helping out that way too.
Yeah.
It looks like Margot has a question. Margot, this would be something new for you.
No, I just wanted to compliment you guys on a phenomenal talk. Tony, Jevi, Kyle was fantastic. And I just had a question, Kyle, related to what you brought up at the end of your talk, related to liability, malpractice.
Mm-hmm.
What's the importance of like physician agreements and understanding the EAP when you're heading to these, remote places and you might not necessarily be familiar with the environments?
Yeah, it's a moving target, right? There's no one set thing. That's probably the most complicating part of the whole thing. Different institutions. I mean, this goes into like when you travel there and getting permission to go there from your institution and making sure you have coverage from there. Some institutions will cover you, some won't. Some places where you travel require the countries themselves require you to have a medical license, and some don't. And that's kind of like some places you can probably get by without knowing and no one will care. But other places will care a lot. And so it depends. If you're setting up a clinic that's going to treat, locals, local citizens, I think you need to be a little bit more aware of it that way. But even for my institution here, they've become over the years much more concerned about making sure you have, liability coverage. And part of that for here is saying, hey, does that country require you to have a license to practice, even though you're only treating, U.S. athletes and staff? They still become, concerned about that. And then some countries it's not even a national system. You have to go down to the level of, in Switzerland, you have to go down to the level of the canton to figure out what the specific canton or province or things like that, what their requirements are. So sometimes it'll take a lot of legwork to try to figure out what the rules are, and even included in there is trying to navigate, language barriers, because sometimes you'll call or email the Swedish Department of Health and they'll be like, no, we have some Swedish one is actually great. They're like, oh, you're a team doc? No worries, we cover it. It's not an issue. But other places are like, absolutely no, you definitely need a license. And in order to get a license, you need to have a bank account in country or speak the language fluently or have a sponsoring physician to cover you. So it's really interesting. When you think it's a very simple thing, it can become more. And I'm not trying to dissuade anybody. Please continue. Like, it's navigable. It just takes time and some effort to figure it out.
Yeah, no, I think the point is that it's important to ask, right? So that to protect yourself, and some NGBs and the USOPC is great, but it's important that you're able to protect yourself and understand what you're getting into, and then certainly being able to, know what the EAPs are, because sometimes you go to a place like Disney and they say it's proprietary. They're not going to share their EAP with you. So
yeah, and actually it's interesting too, because a lot of times if you are going with sports teams, it's actually and John Finoff of the USOPC, the new USOPC team head doc, he's been great about increasing communication. And so I know the team doc for US ski and snowboard. And so times when I travel places with the Paralympic ski team, I'm able to just say, hey, Jaron, do you have the EAP for this place? Because it's helpful for me. But so you don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. But yeah, you go to some places and it may not be as accessible. But the thing with liability too is some people are like, oh, it's Good Samaritan rules. That doesn't, if you're going as an identified team doc, that's not going to cover you. So you just need to make sure that you're aware of what those rules are.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I will say, it looks like it's a little after 9:30, so I'll end it here just so to respect your guys' time. But thank you so much for coming and for sharing your experiences. Those are all like very interesting stories. And I just wanted to give a little shout out for some of the upcoming webinars that we have in December. So next Monday, the 11th, same time, 8:30 p.m. Eastern time, there's a webinar on different patient populations within sports med with a 6-member speaker panel. And then that Tuesday, the 12th, again, same time, there's a webinar on concussion in young athletes that will be given by Dr. Mark Halstead. And then Monday, the 18th, there is the resident officers are giving a webinar on sports ultrasound procedures with Dr. Ryan Cruz. So those are all coming up. And yeah, thank you guys all again. Have a good night.
Thanks for having us. Really appreciate it. If anybody has questions, feel free to reach out and get in touch.
Sure thing.
Definitely.
Thank you all.
Thank you.